In the autumn sky, the sun hung low, casting long shadows across Oakwood Cemetery. Among a small gathering of mourners all dressed in black, I stood, watching as Thomas Blackwood's casket was lowered into the ground. Through the trees, the wind whispered, carrying with it the scent of rain and freshly turned earth. I hadn't known Thomas well, just an old colleague from my university days who, after 20 years of silence, had reached out to me last month. And now he was gone. Beside me, a voice said, he wasn't buried here. I turned to see an elderly woman, perhaps in her 70s, with striking blue eyes that seemed too vibrant for her weathered face. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a black dress that looked like it belonged to another era. "I'm sorry," I said, not sure I'd heard her correctly over the minister's final prayers. At the casket, she stared, her expression unreadable. "Thomas, he wasn't buried here," she repeated, her voice steady and certain. Then she turned those piercing eyes to me. "And you should believe me, Professor Hayes." Down my spine, a chill ran, not just from her words, but from the fact that she knew my name. Before I could ask who she was, she melted into the crowd, disappearing between the mourners as they began to disperse. As I made my way to the small reception at Thomas's house, I tried to shake off the encounter. It was a Victorian-style home on the outskirts of Millfield, the kind of place that seemed to belong in a Gothic novel rather than a modern suburb. Inside, people mingled awkwardly, most of them strangers to each other, connected only by their relationship to the deceased. "James Hayes, isn't it?" A tall man in an expensive suit approached me, holding out his hand. "I'm Richard Blackwood, Thomas's brother. Thank you for coming." I shook his hand. "I'm sorry for your loss. Thomas and I were colleagues years ago at Westmore University." Richard nodded. "Yes, he mentioned you. Said you were the only one who might understand." He lowered his voice. "Before he died, did he reach out to you recently?" The question caught me off guard. "He did, actually, about a month ago. He wanted to meet. He said he had something important to discuss, but we never got around to it." A wave of guilt was brought by the memory. I'd been too busy with my own life to make time for an old friend. And now that opportunity was gone forever. Richard's expression tightened. "Did he say what it was about?" "Not specifically, just that he'd made a discovery in his research that he wanted to share. Something about local history, I think." For a moment, Richard studied me, then pulled a business card from his pocket. "If you remember anything else, please call me." In his final weeks, Thomas was troubled. I'm trying to understand why. As Richard walked away, I noticed a familiar face across the room, the elderly woman from the cemetery. By the window, she stood, watching me. When our eyes met, she gestured subtly toward the door before slipping out into the hallway. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed her, finding her waiting at the bottom of a grand staircase. "Professor Hayes," she said, her voice stronger than it had been at the grave site. "My name is Eleanor Winther. I was Thomas's research assistant." "Research assistant?" I repeated, surprised. Thomas had been a history professor specializing in colonial American settlements. I wouldn't have expected someone of her age to be working for him. Slightly, she smiled, as if reading my thoughts. "Not in the traditional sense. I provided access to family records. The Winthrops have been in Millfield since 1692. "What did you mean at the cemetery?" I asked. "About Thomas not being buried there." To ensure we were alone, Eleanor glanced around. "Thomas discovered something that got him killed. And now they're covering it up." Into her purse, she reached and pulled out an old iron key. "This is to Thomas's study, the real one, not the home office everyone knows about. In the basement, there's a hidden room. Go there tonight after everyone leaves. Find his journal. It will explain everything. Before I could question her further, the sound of approaching footsteps caused her to press the key into my hand and hurry away, disappearing down a hallway just as Richard rounded the corner. "Ah, James, I see you've met our local historian," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "Eleanor has some interesting theories about Millfield's past. Most of them unfounded, I'm afraid." "She seems convinced your brother's death wasn't an accident," I said, testing his reaction. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Eleanor sees conspiracies everywhere. The police report was clear. Thomas fell down the stairs after working late. A tragic accident, nothing more." He guided me back toward the reception. "Don't let her fill your head with ghost stories. Millfield has enough of those already." For another hour, the reception dragged on before people began to leave. I lingered, pretending to examine the bookshelves in Thomas's living room while watching Richard out of the corner of my eye. Finally, he approached me again. "I need to attend to some matters at the family law firm," he said. "Martha, our housekeeper, will be here if you need anything, but feel free to stay as long as you like. Thomas always spoke highly of you." Once Richard had gone, I found myself alone in the large house, saved for the elderly housekeeper who was busy cleaning up in the kitchen. In my pocket, the key felt heavy as I made my way to the basement door, which was partially hidden behind a bookcase in the hallway. The basement was finished, but clearly hadn't been updated in decades. Wood paneling lined the walls, and the carpet was a faded green that might have been fashionable in the 1970s. At first glance, it was just a typical basement, a storage area, an old television set, some bookshelves, nothing that resembled a hidden study. Along the wood paneling, I ran my hands, searching for any irregularities. In the far corner, behind a tall filing cabinet, I felt it, a slight depression in the panel. When I pressed it, there was a soft click, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow doorway. The hidden room was small, maybe 10 foot square with no windows. Covered with maps, newspaper clippings, and photographs connected by red string, the walls were a chaotic tapestry. A desk sat in the center, cluttered with papers and books, and a leather-bound journal lay open on top. Behind me, I closed the hidden door and approached the desk. Filled with Thomas's familiar handwriting, the journal's content was far from the academic historical research I'd expected. It detailed local legends, unexplained disappearances, and something called the Millfield Covenant. "The pattern repeats every 33 years, Thomas had written. Always 3 disappearances in the month of October, always dismissed as accidents or runaways. The families involved are always the same, Blackwood, Winther, Carver, and Thorne. Back to 1692, the year of the Covenant, I've traced it. They're protecting something beneath the old church, something that requires a sacrifice. And this year, I fear I may be one of the chosen." The entry was dated October 3rd, just 2 weeks before Thomas's death. As I flipped through the journal, a newspaper clipping fell out. Yellowed with age, it was dated October 1990, exactly 33 years ago. The headline read, "Local man missing, police suspect foul play." The article detailed the disappearance of a Michael Hayes last seen near the old Millfield church. Hayes, my father's name. As I read the article, my hands trembled. My father hadn't disappeared. He died in a car accident when I was 5. At least that's what my mother had always told me. But here was evidence suggesting something else entirely. The sound of a door closing upstairs jolted me back to the present. Quickly, I gathered the journal and the newspaper clipping, stuffing them into my jacket pocket. As I reached for the hidden door, I heard footsteps in the basement. Slow, deliberate steps approaching the hidden room. Frantically, I looked around for another exit, but there was none. The footsteps stopped just outside, then a soft knock. "Professor Hayes," it was Eleanor's voice. "Are you in there?" Relief washed over me as I opened the door to find her standing there looking anxious. "We need to go," she said urgently. "Richard returned early. He knows you're here. How did you get in?" I asked, following her through the basement. Martha let me in the back door. She was Thomas's ally, too, though she doesn't know everything. To a small window near the ceiling, Eleanor led me. This leads to the garden. You can get out this way. As I squeezed through the window, Eleanor handed me a piece of paper. Meet me tomorrow at this address. Bring the journal. To my car, I made it without being seen and drove back to the small bed and breakfast where I was staying during my visit to Millfield. That night, I read Thomas's journal cover to cover, each page more disturbing than the last. Thomas had been researching Millfield's founding families and had discovered a pattern of disappearances dating back centuries. Every 33 years, 3 people vanished in October. The disappearances were always covered up, ruled as accidents, or explained away by the authorities, all of whom were connected to the 4 founding families: Blackwood, Winthrop, Carver, and Thorne. More disturbing was the connection to my own family. According to Thomas's research, the Hayes family had once been part of the original Millfield settlement, but had been driven out in 1692 after opposing something called the Covenant. Since then, at least one Hayes had been among the disappeared in each cycle. It couldn't be coincidence that Thomas had reached out to me, the last living Hayes, just before his death. But why? What did he think I could do? The next morning, I drove to the address Eleanor had given me, a small cottage on the outskirts of town, surrounded by ancient oak trees. On the porch, Eleanor was waiting, looking even more frail in the daylight. You read it, she said as I approached. Not a question, but a statement. I nodded. But you do believe it, she replied, searching my face. Because of your father. How do you know about my father? Eleanor sighed. Come inside. There's more you need to see. The cottage was filled with books and artifacts, like a small museum dedicated to Millfield's history. To a back room, Eleanor led me where a large table was covered with documents, many of them centuries old. The Winthrops have always been record keepers, she explained. While the other families enforced the covenant, mine documented it. Some of us, like my grandmother, tried to fight it. She helped your grandfather escape Millfield in 1957, breaking the cycle, but they found him eventually. And my father in 1990, I added. Eleanor nodded sadly. Thomas discovered the pattern while researching local history. When he realized this year marked another cycle, he began digging deeper. He found me because of my family name, and together we uncovered the truth about the covenant. Which is what exactly? I asked. On the table, Eleanor spread out several documents. They were handwritten in an archaic style, dated 1692. Millfield was failing. Crops dying, children sick, livestock barren. The founding families were desperate. They found something in the caves beneath what is now the old church. Something ancient. It offered prosperity in exchange for sacrifice. Human sacrifice, I said, the words feeling ridiculous even as evidence to the contrary lay before me. 3 souls every 33 years, Eleanor confirmed. 1 from each family, except the Winthrops, who became the keepers, and 1 from outside, usually someone who threatened to expose them. Your ancestor opposed the covenant. So, the Hayes family became the eternal outsiders, always marked for sacrifice. That's why Thomas contacted me, I realized. He knew I was in danger. Yes. And now he's gone, which means they've already chosen their first victim for this cycle. You would have been the outsider, but now, she trailed off. Now I'm a threat, I finished. Just like Thomas was. Eleanor nodded gravely. The second sacrifice is traditionally taken on October 21st. That's tomorrow. The third on Halloween night. We need to go to the police, I said. Eleanor's laugh was bitter. Chief Thorne, he's one of them. As is Judge Carver and Mayor Blackwood. They control everything in Millfield. Then we need evidence, I said. Concrete proof of what they've done. Thomas believed he found it, Eleanor said. the entrance to the caves beneath the old church. In his last entry, he wrote that he discovered how to access them through the Blackwood Mausoleum in Oakwood Cemetery. The same cemetery where we had his funeral, I murmured. When you said he wasn't buried there, the body in that casket wasn't Thomas, Eleanor said firmly. I've known him for 2 years. That man had different hands, different teeth. They're using the funeral to cover up what really happened to him. It sounded insane. Yet, I couldn't dismiss it. Not with everything I'd read, everything I'd seen. Not with the newspaper article about my father that contradicted everything I'd been told about his death. We need to get into that mausoleum, I said. Tonight, Eleanor agreed. As dusk fell, I met Eleanor at the cemetery gates. She carried an old lantern and a bag containing what looked like antique tools. Blackwood Mausoleum is the largest one near the center, she whispered as we made our way through the darkened graveyard. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in a silvery light that made the gravestones look like they were glowing from within. We found the mausoleum easily, a grand structure of marble and granite, with the Blackwood family crest carved above the entrance. The heavy iron door was locked with a padlock that looked far newer than the rest of the structure. They've been here recently, Eleanor observed, pulling out a set of old skeleton keys. Fortunately, the Winthrops have keys to all the family crypts, part of our keeper duties. It took several attempts, but eventually one of the keys turned in the lock. With a groan that seemed to echo through the entire cemetery, the door swung open. Inside, the mausoleum was lined with stone shelves containing coffins of various ages. Names and dates were carved into plaques on each one, generations of Blackwoods dating back to the 1600s. Thomas's notes mentioned a mechanism behind the oldest coffin, Eleanor said, shining her lantern toward the back of the crypt. Edmund Blackwood, 1655 to 1720. Carefully, we approached the ancient coffin. Unlike the others, it was made of stone rather than wood and appeared to be part of the wall itself. Along the edge, Eleanor ran her hands, feeling for anything unusual. Here, she said, pressing on a carved rose at the corner of the coffin. There was a grinding sound, and the entire back wall of the mausoleum began to slide open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Thomas was right, I breathed, peering down into the blackness. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something metallic and ancient. We should hurry, Eleanor said, already starting down the stairs. They may check here tonight. With the cycle nearing completion. The staircase descended for what felt like hundreds of feet, spiraling deeper and deeper beneath the cemetery. From worked stone to natural rock, the walls changed, indicating we had entered a cave system. Finally, we emerged into a large cavern lit by an eerie blue phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from the very walls. In the center of the cavern stood an altar, a flat stone table surrounded by 4 stone chairs, each carved with one of the founding family crests. The altar itself was stained dark, and I didn't need to ask with what. This is where they performed the ritual, Eleanor whispered, her voice echoing slightly despite her hushed tone. Cautiously, I approached the altar. Carved into its surface was an intricate symbol, a tree with 4 main branches, its roots extending down into what appeared to be a face or mask of some kind. Around the edge of the altar, words were carved in a language I didn't recognize. It's asking for blood, Eleanor said, interpreting the symbols. Blood to feed the roots of Millfield. A sound from behind us made us both turn sharply. There at the entrance to the cavern stood Richard Blackwood alongside an older man in a police uniform and a woman in expensive clothing who bore a striking resemblance to the judge who had presided over the court when I'd visited earlier that day. I told you he'd lead us to her, Richard said calmly. The Hayes blood always returns to Millfield eventually. Eleanor Winther, the woman said, her voice cold. You've betrayed your duty as a keeper. My duty is to the truth, Margaret, Eleanor replied, standing straighter despite her age. The Covenant has taken enough lives. The police chief, Chief Thorne, I presumed, stepped forward. The Covenant has kept Millfield prosperous for over 3 centuries. Look around you. No poverty, no crime, no illness. Perfect harvests every year. What's the price of 3 lives every 33 years compared to that? You're insane, I said, backing away as they advanced into the cavern. You're talking about murder. Sacrifice, Richard corrected. A necessary one. Your friend Thomas understood that in the end. As will you. As they moved toward us, I noticed something on the ground behind the altar, a dark shape that I'd initially taken for a shadow. Looking closer, I realized with horror that it was a body face down on the cavern floor. Thomas, Eleanor gasped, following my gaze. Richard smiled. Yes, we brought him here 3 days ago. The first sacrifice of this cycle. His body double was quite convincing at the funeral, wasn't it? A little makeup goes a long way. You killed him because he discovered the truth, I said. We killed him because it was his time, the judge, Margaret Carver, replied. As it is Eleanor's time now. And yours on Halloween, Professor Hayes. From beneath his jacket, Chief Thorne pulled a ceremonial dagger. The blood must flow as it has for centuries. Nothing personal. Frantically, I looked around for a weapon, an escape route, anything. My eyes fell on Thomas's body again, and this time I noticed something clutched in his hand, a small device of some kind. Eleanor, I said quietly. Get behind me. As Chief Thorne approached with the dagger, I lunged toward Thomas's body, grabbing the device from his hand. It was a remote detonator, the kind used for controlled explosions in mining or construction. Thomas had come prepared. Stop! Richard shouted, realizing what I was holding. This entire cave system is unstable. Good, I said, my finger hovering over the button. Then back away and let us leave. The 3 of them exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. Finally, Chief Thorne lowered the dagger. You don't understand what you're interfering with, Margaret said. The covenant must be fulfilled. If not, what sleeps beneath Millfield will awaken, and the consequences will be far worse than 3 deaths. I'll take my chances, I replied, backing toward the entrance with Eleanor. We made it to the staircase, the detonator still in my hand. As we began to climb, Richard called out after us. You can't escape Millfield, Hayes. Your blood is marked. It always has been. We emerged from the mausoleum into the cemetery, which was now eerily quiet. The moon had risen higher, casting long shadows across the gravestones. We need to get out of town, I said as we hurried toward the gates. They'll be coming after us. Not right away, Eleanor replied. The ritual has specific timing. They need to complete it by Halloween, but they'll regroup first. Make a plan. We have a little time. We reached my car, parked a block from the cemetery, and drove straight to Eleanor's cottage. Inside, she quickly began gathering documents. We need evidence, she explained, stuffing papers into a weathered leather satchel. Records of all the disappearances, the original covenant document, everything I've collected over the years. Where will we go? I asked. Eleanor paused, considering. My niece lives in Boston. We can stay with her while we figure out our next move. As she continued gathering materials, I examined the detonator I'd taken from Thomas's hand. It was simple but effective. Military grade from the look of it. Thomas had come to those caves prepared to end the covenant permanently. Thomas knew he was going to die, I said quietly. He planted explosives in the cave system. Eleanor stopped what she was doing and looked at me. Are you sure? I nodded. This is a detonator. He must have set charges throughout the caves. That's why Richard was so afraid when he saw it. Heavily, Eleanor sat down in a nearby chair. Thomas never mentioned explosives to me. Maybe he didn't want to involve you, I suggested. Or maybe he set them as a last resort. A thought occurred to me then. Eleanor, what did Margaret mean about something sleeping beneath Millfield? What exactly does the Covenant keep at bay? Eleanor's expression grew troubled. There are older stories from before the European settlers arrived. The native tribes avoided this valley because they believed something evil lived beneath it, something that fed on blood and caused madness in those who heard its whispers. The founding families didn't create the Covenant. They merely inherited it. Before I could respond, headlights swept across the cottage windows. A car was coming up the long driveway. "They're here already," Eleanor said, grabbing her satchel. "We need to go now." We slipped out the back door just as car doors slammed in front. Through the trees, I could make out 2 police cruisers and Richard's sleek black sedan. "This way," Eleanor whispered, leading me into the woods behind her cottage. "There's an old logging road about half a mile east. It connects to the highway." As quickly and quietly as possible, we moved through the dark forest, guided only by the moonlight filtering through the trees. Behind us, I could hear shouting and the beams of flashlights as our pursuers realized we had fled. "They'll catch up to us soon," I said, helping Eleanor over a fallen log. Despite her determination, her age made moving through the rough terrain difficult. "Keep going," she insisted. "We're almost there." As we continued through the woods, the sound of pursuit grew fainter. Either we were outpacing them or they had split up to cover more ground. Neither possibility was particularly comforting. Finally, we emerged onto the promised logging road, little more than a dirt track cutting through the forest, but wide enough for a vehicle. "Now what?" I asked, looking up and down the empty road. Eleanor pointed east. 2 miles that way, we'll reach the highway. From there, we can flag down a passing car or walk to the truck stop at the county line. We had gone perhaps half a mile when the sound of an engine approached from behind. Headlights appeared around a bend in the road and a police cruiser came into view. "Into the trees," Eleanor hissed, pulling me off the road. We crouched in the underbrush as the cruiser slowly passed our hiding spot, its spotlight sweeping across the road and into the woods. For a moment, I thought we were safe. Then the brake lights flashed red and the cruiser began to reverse. "They've seen something," I whispered. From her satchel, Eleanor reached and pulled out a small revolver. "My husband's," she explained, seeing my surprise. "I've never fired it, but Thomas insisted I keep it loaded." The cruiser stopped and Chief Thorne stepped out, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Hayes," he called. "I know you're out here. There's nowhere to run in Millfield. This town belongs to the Covenant." As he moved toward our hiding place, Eleanor raised the revolver with shaking hands. Before she could fire, however, another set of headlights appeared on the road. A large truck moving fast. Chief Thorne turned, momentarily distracted by the approaching vehicle. It was all the opportunity we needed. From our hiding place, we burst and ran toward the road, waving our arms frantically as the truck approached. The driver saw us and slowed, but didn't stop completely. Instead, the passenger door swung open as the truck rolled past at about 15 miles per hour. "Jump!" I shouted, grabbing Eleanor's arm. We launched ourselves at the moving vehicle, barely managing to clamber inside as Chief Thorne ran toward us, shouting. The driver, a bearded man in his 40s, looked at us with wide eyes. "What the hell? Are you folks in some kind of trouble?" "Please." Eleanor gasped. "Just drive. Get us out of Millfield." The driver hesitated for only a moment before accelerating away from the pursuing police chief. In the side mirror, I could see Thorne running back to his cruiser. "He'll be after us," I warned. "Not on this rig, he won't," the driver replied, shifting gears as the truck picked up speed. "I'm headed straight through to Boston. That work for you?" Eleanor and I exchanged glances. "Boston is perfect," I said. As we put distance between ourselves and Millfield, I felt the detonator in my pocket. Thomas had given us a way to end the Covenant permanently. But at what cost? If Eleanor was right about what slept beneath Millfield, would destroying the caves unleash something worse? The truck driver, who introduced himself as Dan, didn't ask too many questions after we explained we were fleeing an abusive situation. He dropped us at the bus station in Boston early the next morning, refusing the money we offered for gas. "You folks take care now," he said before driving away. "Hope whatever you're running from stays behind you." Eleanor's niece, Catherine, lived in a brownstone in Back Bay. She welcomed us without hesitation, though her eyes widened at her aunt's disheveled appearance and wild story. "You should both rest," she said after getting us settled in her guest room. "Then we can figure out what to do next." But rest wouldn't come easily. As I lay on the uncomfortable sofa bed, Thomas's journal open beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only temporarily escaped. The covenant had existed for centuries. Its adherents wouldn't give up easily. The next morning, over coffee, Eleanor spread out her documents on Catherine's dining table. There were birth and death records, newspaper clippings about disappearances, and copies of letters between Winthrop family members dating back generations, all documenting the covenant's bloody history. "We need to get this to someone who can help," I said, organizing the papers into a cohesive narrative. "The FBI, maybe." Catherine, who worked as a journalist for the Boston Globe, examined some of the documents. "This is incredible if it's true, but you're talking about some of the most powerful families in Massachusetts. They have connections everywhere." "Not everywhere," Eleanor insisted. "The covenant's power is strongest in Millfield. Outside its boundaries, they're vulnerable." "What about the detonator?" I asked. "If Thomas planted explosives in the cave system, we could end this now." Eleanor shook her head. "Not without knowing what else we might unleash. The covenant is evil, but it exists for a reason. Those caves might contain something worse." Catherine looked between us, clearly struggling to believe everything she was hearing. "Aunt Eleanor, this all sounds insane," Eleanor finished for her. "I know, but it's real, Catherine. Every 33 years, 3 people disappear in Millfield. Check the records yourself if you don't believe me." As Catherine and Eleanor continued discussing the evidence, I stepped away to examine the detonator more closely. It was a simple device, a red button protected by a clear plastic cover with a small LCD screen showing a battery indicator and signal strength. The range was limited, probably no more than 20 m. If we were going to use it, we would need to return to Millfield. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Turn on the news." Catherine had a small television in her kitchen. I switched it on and found a news channel. The headline made my blood run cold. "Small town historian found dead in Boston." The image showed Eleanor's cottage surrounded by police tape. "Eleanor," I called, my voice tight. "You need to see this." She and Catherine joined me as the newscaster continued. Eleanor Winthrop, 72, was found dead in her niece's Boston apartment this morning. An apparent suicide. Winthrop left a note confessing to the murder of Thomas Blackwood in Millfield last week, citing a delusional belief in a town conspiracy. Millfield police are coordinating with Boston authorities to investigate. "That's impossible," Catherine whispered, looking at her very much alive aunt. "They're framing me," Eleanor said grimly. "And now they know where we are." As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see 2 Boston police officers standing on the stoop with a familiar figure behind them, Richard Blackwood. "The back door," Catherine said urgently, already moving. "There's a fire escape. I'll stall them." Eleanor and I grabbed our documents and hurried through the kitchen to the rear of the brownstone. As we slipped out onto the fire escape, I could hear Catherine opening the front door, her voice perfectly calm as she greeted the officers. We descended the metal stairs as quietly as possible, emerging into an alley behind the building. Eleanor was breathing heavily, the exertion clearly taking a toll on her. "We need somewhere safe to go," I said, supporting her as we made our way to the street. Eleanor nodded toward a nearby church. "There. Sacred ground has power even they respect," at least temporarily. Inside the church, a few parishioners sat in quiet prayer, paying us little attention as we slipped into a back pew. Eleanor's hands trembled as she arranged her documents. "They'll find us eventually," she whispered. "Richard won't stop until the covenant is fulfilled." I looked at the detonator in my hand. "Then maybe it's time to end this. We go back to Millfield, to the caves. We set off Thomas's explosives." Eleanor's eyes widened. "And risk releasing whatever the covenant has contained all these centuries. What choice do we have?" I asked. "They'll never stop coming for us. For the next haze after me, for your family." For a long moment, Eleanor was silent, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps it's time to face the darkness, whatever it may be." "But we'll need help," I said. "Catherine, no," Eleanor said firmly. "I won't put her in danger. But there are others who know about the covenant. Descendants of those who escaped Millfield over the years." Thomas kept a list in his journal. I flipped through the journal until I found it. Names and addresses scattered across the country. People like me who had lost family to the covenant. "We don't have time to contact all of them," I said. "We don't need to," Eleanor replied. "Just one." She pointed to a name near the bottom of the list. Daniel Carter. He lives in Worcester, less than an hour from here. His grandfather escaped the 1957 cycle. According to Thomas, Daniel has been researching the covenant for years. Cautiously, we left the church, keeping to crowded areas as we made our way to the bus station. The afternoon news played on television screens throughout the terminal, now reporting that I was wanted for questioning in connection with both Thomas's death and Eleanor's murder. Our faces were everywhere. "We'll need disguises," Eleanor murmured as we purchased tickets to Worcester. In the bus station bathroom, Eleanor removed her signature bun, letting her silver hair fall loose around her shoulders. She applied lipstick and borrowed a colorful scarf from a woman at the next sink, who took pity on her forgetfulness. I used a pair of reading glasses purchased from a convenience store kiosk and ran my hands through my hair until it stood up in an uncharacteristic mess. The changes were subtle, but effective enough to get us past the cursory glances of busy commuters. We boarded the Worcester bus without incident, sitting near the back and keeping our heads down. Daniel Carter lived in a modest apartment above a bookstore in downtown Worcester. When we knocked on his door, the man who answered matched Thomas's description in the journal. Mid-30s with a professor's demeanor and watchful eyes. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not interested," he began, then stopped abruptly, his gaze focusing on Eleanor. "You're a Winthrop." Eleanor nodded. "And this is James Hayes. We need your help, Mr. Carter. It's about the covenant." Daniel's expression hardened, but he stepped aside to let us in. The apartment was essentially a research center with maps covering the walls and bookshelves overflowing with historical texts. On a large corkboard, photographs and newspaper clippings had been arranged in a timeline spanning centuries, all documenting the three disappearance pattern we now knew so well. "Thomas Blackwood contacted me last month," Daniel said, closing and locking the door behind us. "Said he'd found the entrance to the caves. I told him he was a fool to go looking. He found it," I confirmed. "And it got him killed." Over the next hour, we shared everything we knew about the covenant, the caves, and the detonator. Daniel listened intently, occasionally adding details from his own research. "My grandfather escaped Millfield in 1957, he explained. He was supposed to be one of the sacrifices, but a Winthrop helped him get away. Your grandmother, I believe," he added, nodding to Eleanor. "Evelyn," Eleanor said softly. "She never spoke of it, but I found her journals after she died." Daniel turned to his corkboard, pointing to a faded photograph of a stern-looking man. "This is Jeremiah Carter, my grandfather. He spent the rest of his life researching the covenant, trying to understand what he'd escaped. He believed there was something ancient beneath Millfield, something that predated human settlement in the area." "Did he know what it was?" I asked. Daniel hesitated. He had theories. The native tribes called it the hunger that does not die. They believed it influenced minds, creating bloodlust and madness in those who heard its whispers. The settlers who founded Millfield didn't discover it by accident. They were drawn there by it. And the covenant was their attempt to contain it, Eleanor added. Or feed it in a controlled way, Daniel suggested. 3 sacrifices every 33 years to keep it dormant. The question is, if you destroy the caves, do you destroy it or simply release it? I fingered the detonator in my pocket. Thomas seemed to think explosion was the answer. Thomas might have known something we don't, Daniel acknowledged. He had access to the Blackwood family records. If anyone understood the true nature of what lies beneath Millfield, it would be a Blackwood. So we go back, I said. We finish what Thomas started. Daniel looked between us, his expression grim. If you're determined to do this, you'll need more help than just me, and we'll need a plan. They'll be watching for you. Halloween is in 3 days, Eleanor reminded us. They'll need their 3rd sacrifice by then. Then we have 3 days to prepare, Daniel said, moving to his computer. First, we need to get word to the others on Thomas's list. Warn them what's coming. Then, we gather whatever weapons and supplies we can. If we're going back to Millfield, we're going prepared for war. Over the next 2 days, Daniel reached out to his network of researchers and conspiracy theorists, people who had been studying the Covenant for years. Some dismissed him as paranoid, but others, particularly those who had lost family members to Millfield's 33-year cycle, believed. By October 30th, we had assembled a small group, myself, Eleanor, Daniel, and 3 others, all descendants of families who had escaped the Covenant's reach. In an abandoned warehouse outside Worcester, we gathered, surrounded by maps of Millfield and the equipment we'd managed to acquire. The entrance through the Blackwood Mausoleum will be guarded now, Daniel said, pointing to a detailed map of Oakwood Cemetery. But there's another way in. According to my grandfather's research, all 4 founding family crypts connect to the cave system, the Winthrop Mausoleum. That's why we've always been the keepers, Eleanor realized. We maintain access to the caves. Exactly. And as a Winthrop, you should have a key. Yes, Eleanor nodded, pulling out her ring of skeleton keys. I have keys to all the family crypts. It's tradition. Daniel turned to the rest of the group. Tomorrow night is Halloween. They'll be preparing for the final sacrifice. While they're distracted, we enter through the Winthrop crypt, find Thomas's explosives, and end this once and for all. And if we unleash something worse, one of the others asked, a woman named Sarah, whose brother had disappeared in 1990. Then at least we'll face it together, Daniel replied. Better than letting them continue sacrificing innocent people for another 300 years. That night, as the others slept, I sat alone with Thomas's journal, reading his final entries over and over. Something wasn't adding up. If Thomas had planted explosives, why hadn't he detonated them himself? Why leave the detonator clutched in his hand where I would find it? Unless he had learned something at the end, something that made him hesitate. I flipped to the very last page where a series of numbers were scrawled in a shaky hand. 17492113, they meant nothing to me, but they had meant something to Thomas. Important enough to be his final message. The next morning, Halloween, we loaded our equipment into 2 nondescript vans and began the drive back to Millfield. The plan was simple: wait until dusk, enter through the Winthrop Mausoleum, set off the explosives, and escape before anyone knew we were there. As we approached the town limits, an uneasy feeling settled over me. Millfield looked normal from the outside. Quaint New England architecture, fall decorations adorning porches, children in Halloween costumes running from house to house collecting candy. Nothing to suggest the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. We parked the vans in the woods about a mile from the cemetery and waited for nightfall. As darkness descended, the last of the trick-or-treaters returned home and the streets grew quiet. It's time, Daniel said, checking his watch. Everyone remember the plan. In and out as quickly as possible. We moved through the woods in single file, avoiding the main roads. The cemetery gates were locked, but the old wrought iron fence had gaps large enough for us to slip through. Inside, the headstones cast long shadows in the moonlight, creating a maze of darkness. To the Winthrop Mausoleum, Eleanor led us, smaller and less ornate than the Blackwood crypt, but still imposing in the moonlight. Slightly, her hands trembled as she fitted the key into the lock. "My family has been complicit in this for generations," she whispered. "Tonight we make amends." With a creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet cemetery, the door swung open. Inside, stone shelves lined the walls bearing the coffins of Winthrops dating back to the town's founding. At the back, behind the oldest coffin, Eleanor found what we were looking for, a small carved bird that, when pressed, revealed a hidden passageway. "Just like the Blackwood crypt," I murmured. We descended the narrow stairs, flashlights illuminating the rough-hewn walls. The passage was older than the one we'd used before, with roots breaking through the ceiling and moisture making the steps treacherously slippery. After what seemed like an eternity, the passage opened into a familiar cavern. The same blue phosphorescence lighting the walls, the same stone altar at the center. But this time, the cavern wasn't empty. 4 figures stood around the altar, each wearing a hooded robe embroidered with their family crest. Richard Blackwood, Chief Thorne, Judge Carver, and a 4th person I didn't recognize, presumably the current head of the Winthrop family in Eleanor's absence. Between them, strapped to the altar, was a struggling figure, a young woman, perhaps in her 20s. "The third sacrifice," Daniel whispered, pulling us back into the shadows of the passage. We watched in horror as Richard raised a ceremonial dagger, his voice echoing through the cavern as he recited words in that strange ancient language. The other 3 joined in, their voices creating a discordant harmony that made my skin crawl. "We need to stop them," Sarah whispered urgently. "Wait," I said, my eyes scanning the cavern walls. "Look for the explosives. Thomas must have hidden them somewhere." As the chanting grew louder, I noticed something unusual about the cavern floor. A series of small dark objects placed at regular intervals around the perimeter. They were partially buried, almost invisible against the dark stone. "There," I pointed. "The charges. They're already in position." Daniel nodded. "We need to get that girl off the altar first." I pulled out the detonator, my thumb hovering over the button. "I'll create a distraction. The rest of you grab the girl and get back to the passage." Before they could argue, I stepped out of the shadows. "Richard," I called. "I believe you've been looking for me." All 4 hooded figures turned, their chanting cut short. Richard lowered his dagger, his surprise giving way to a cold smile. "James Hayes," he said. "You've saved us the trouble of hunting you down. How fitting that you should arrive just in time to witness the Covenant's renewal." "I came to end it," I replied, holding up the detonator where they could see it. "Thomas left me a parting gift." Richard's smile faltered. "You don't understand what you're doing, Hayes. The Covenant keeps this town safe. Keeps the world safe." "Safe from what?" "Your own bloodlust." I took a step forward, keeping their attention on me as Daniel and the others crept along the cavern wall toward the altar. "From what sleeps beneath," Judge Carver said, her voice eerily calm. "What has always slept here, feeding on the blood we provide. If it wakes fully, no one in Millfield will survive. Perhaps no one for miles around." "You're lying," I said, though a flicker of doubt crept into my mind. What if they were telling the truth? What if Thomas had realized this at the end? The numbers in the journal suddenly came back to me. 17492113, not random numbers, a code. On an impulse, I converted them to letters. QDUM. No, that wasn't right. It would be based on the standard English alphabet. A equals 1, B equals 2, etc. That would make it QD, still nonsensical. Unless. Odium, I whispered, understanding dawning. Latin for hatred or disgust. Richard's eyes widened. He told you. Enough of this, Chief Thorne growled, drawing a gun from beneath his robe. Give me the detonator, Hayes. As he raised the weapon, Daniel and the others made their move, rushing toward the altar. Sarah tackled the Winthrop representative while Daniel and the others freed the young woman from her restraints. Chaos erupted in the cavern. Judge Carver and the Winthrop elder tried to block the passage back to the surface. Chief Thorne fired his gun, the shot going wide and ricocheting off the stone walls. For me, Richard lunged, trying to wrest the detonator from my grip. You'll doom us all, he shouted as we struggled. In the confusion, Eleanor made her way to my side. James, she said urgently. The journal. What did you realize? Odium, I gasped, still fighting off Richard. It's not something physical beneath Millfield. It's hatred itself. The town was founded on it, feeds on it. The covenant doesn't contain something external. It perpetuates the cycle of hatred. Eleanor's eyes widened with understanding. That's why Thomas planted the explosives. Not to kill whatever's down here, but to break the cycle. Destroy the ritual site forever. From my grip, Richard broke free, stumbling backward. You're wrong, he snarled. The odium is real. It speaks to us, guides us. Without the covenant, it will consume everyone, not just the chosen sacrifices. No, Eleanor said firmly. It's your belief that gives it power. Break the cycle. Break its hold. Daniel and the others had reached the passage with the rescued woman. Now, James, he shouted. Set it off. One last desperate lunge for the detonator was made by Richard. As we grappled, I felt the plastic cover snap back, exposing the red button. Without hesitation, I pressed it. There was a moment of absolute silence, then a low rumble that quickly built to a deafening roar. The cavern walls began to shake, dust and small rocks raining down from the ceiling. Run! I shouted, grabbing Eleanor's arm and pulling her toward the passage. Behind us, Richard fell to his knees, hands raised toward the altar as if in prayer. The other Covenant members scrambled for escape routes, their unity shattered by fear. We raced up the narrow stairs as the rumbling intensified. The very foundation of the passage seemed to be coming apart, ancient stonework crumbling under the force of the explosions Thomas had set. Keep going, Daniel called from ahead, helping the others navigate the increasingly treacherous steps. Eleanor stumbled, her strength finally giving out. As best I could, I lifted her, half carrying her up the remaining stairs as the world collapsed around us. We burst out of the Winthrop mausoleum just as a tremendous crack split the ground of the cemetery. Gravestones toppled and a massive sinkhole began to form where the 4 family crypts had stood. The others were already racing toward the cemetery gates. Looking back, I saw the Blackwood mausoleum disappear entirely into the growing chasm, followed quickly by the Thorne and Carver crypts. The ground beneath the Winthrop mausoleum began to crumble just as we cleared its shadow. Don't look back, Eleanor gasped as I carried her toward safety. Just run. We made it to the gates as the sinkhole stabilized, having swallowed nearly a quarter of the cemetery. In the distance, sirens wailed as Millfield awoke to the destruction. The vans, Daniel reminded us. We need to go before they seal off the area. Into the vehicles, we piled and drove away from Millfield as fast as we dared without attracting attention. No one spoke until we were miles beyond the town limits. Did we succeed? Sarah finally asked. Is it over? The covenant is broken, Eleanor said quietly. The ritual site is destroyed. Whether that ends the cycle completely or just interrupts it, only time will tell. The young woman we had rescued, Jessica, we learned, had been abducted from a neighboring town the day before. She had no connection to Millfield or its founding families, just an outsider chosen for sacrifice. They said I was special, she told us as we drove through the night. That my blood would complete some kind of cycle. I thought they were just crazy cultists. In a way, they were, I replied. Victims of their own dark history. At dawn, we parted ways, each going in separate directions to make tracking us more difficult. Daniel took Jessica to the nearest hospital in a different county, while Sarah and the others scattered across New England. With me, Eleanor came, still too frail to travel alone. "Where will you go?" she asked as we drove west on the interstate. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "Away from Millfield, away from Massachusetts. Somewhere to start over." Thoughtfully, Eleanor nodded. "The Hayes family has been running for generations. Perhaps it's time to stop running." A week later, we settled in a small town in Vermont, far enough from Millfield to feel safe, but close enough to keep an eye on news from the area. For days, reports of the cemetery's sinkhole dominated local headlines, attributed to old mining tunnels collapsing beneath the graveyard. There was no mention of the covenant, no acknowledgement of the true reason for the destruction. Into a small cottage on the edge of town, Eleanor moved. Away from the shadow of Millfield, her health gradually improved. At the local community college, I found work teaching, much as I had before Thomas's funeral had upended my life. Daniel kept in touch, sending updates from his ongoing research. The pattern of disappearances in Millfield had apparently been broken. For the first time in centuries, Halloween had passed without a third sacrifice. More importantly, something had changed in the town itself. Lifelong residents reported feeling as if a weight had been lifted. A darkness receded. Children played more freely. Neighbors spoke more kindly to one another. Small changes, perhaps, but significant ones. "The odium's influence is waning," Eleanor observed when I shared Daniel's reports. "Without the ritual to feed it, its hold on Millfield is breaking down." "So Thomas was right," I said. The explosives weren't to kill some physical entity. They were to break the psychological hold the covenant had on the town. "On all of us," Eleanor corrected gently. "The Winthrops, the Blackwoods, the Thorns, the Carvers, and the Hayes family, too. We were all bound by it, generation after generation." As winter settled over our new home, I often found myself thinking about Thomas's final message. Odium. Hatred. The emotion that had driven the covenant for centuries. Not a monster beneath the ground, but the darkness within human hearts, cultivated and fed through ritual sacrifice. One evening, as snow fell outside my window, I received a package from Daniel. Inside was a newspaper clipping from the Millfield Gazette dated the previous week. The headline read, "Richard Blackwood steps down as head of Family Foundation. Cites need for new direction." Beneath it was a handwritten note from Daniel. "The cycle is broken. Thomas would be proud." I showed the clipping to Eleanor when she visited the next day. Thoughtfully, she studied it, then smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from her since we'd fled Millfield. "He wasn't buried there," she said softly. "Thomas. Not really. His body was in that cave, but his spirit was free of the covenant long before we destroyed it." "And we believed you," I replied, taking her frail hand in mine. "Just as you said we should." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering our small town in a blanket of white. In the spring, Eleanor planned to plant a garden, something she'd never done in Millfield, where the soil always felt tainted somehow. I had begun researching my family history, tracing the Hayes line back beyond their connection to the covenant. The past would always be there, shadows lingering in the corners of memory, but the cycle was broken. The hatred that had sustained the covenant for centuries was finally beginning to fade. And in its place, something new had a chance to grow.